registration. What are you doing parked here?
This is my property. What's your legal reason for detaining me?
You're being suspicious. Step out and identify yourself now.
But I do not consent to any searches or unlawful detention.
The law is meant to be a protective shield, an invisible barrier designed to safeguard the rights of the innocent. But when placed in the wrong hands, when filtered through the lens of unchecked arrogance and profound bias, that shield can swiftly be weaponized. Sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice aren't delivered from the elevated bench of a courtroom. Sometimes they are taught in the dead of night on a quiet suburban driveway when a catastrophic misjudgment meets an immovable pillar of constitutional law. Have you ever been unfairly judged or targeted purely based on an assumption about who you are or where you belong? Let us know your experience in the comments below as we dive into a story that proves why knowing your rights is your ultimate defense. Shadows stretched long and deep across the manicured lawns of one of the county's most prestigious zip codes. It was just past 9 in the evening, and this hyper-wealthy enclave was shrouded in an expensive, intentional silence. Homes here were set far back from the street, hidden behind ancient, towering oaks and wrought iron gates. Drifting seamlessly through this tranquil darkness was a flawless, midnight-hued, luxury flagship sedan. Behind the leather-stitched steering wheel sat a man named Arthur Vance. At 55, Arthur possessed a commanding, dignified presence. He was dressed in a meticulously tailored slate-gray suit. The knot of his silk tie finally loosened after a grueling, endless day. To anyone observing, he appeared to be exactly what he was, a highly accomplished professional returning to his private sanctuary. However, Arthur was not a hedge fund manager or a tech visionary. He was the chief United States District Judge for the Federal Circuit. He was a legal titan, a man who spent his waking hours navigating the absolute highest echelons of the federal justice system. His signature alone possessed the gravity to authorize sweeping federal wiretaps, and he held the terrifying unilateral authority to dismantle criminal prosecutions if a single law enforcement officer stepped a fraction of an inch over the line of constitutional bounds. But tonight, the gavel was down. Arthur was simply a weary man seeking the comfort of his home, sinking into the ventilated seating of his quiet, climate-controlled cabin, letting the acoustic engineering of the vehicle wash away the heavy burdens of the federal bench. Yet completely unbeknownst to him, his peaceful commute was being closely monitored. Lurking several hundred yards behind, intentionally mirroring the sedan's every turn, while operating solely on dim running lights, was a heavy police interceptor. At the wheel was Officer David Miller, an 8-year veteran of the local department who had spent entirely too long patrolling this specific affluent bubble. Miller knew every street, every cul-de-sac, and nearly every regular resident. Over the years, routine had bred a dangerous kind of complacency, and complacency had mutated into a deeply ingrained implicit bias. In Miller's skewed perception of the world, a distinguished minority individual operating a vehicle worth more than most mortgages in this specific neighborhood was an anomaly that required aggressive investigation. Miller had already run the luxury vehicle's plates through the statewide database. The system had returned a pristine response, registered legally, fully insured, with 0 active warrants. For a professional, objective officer, a clean tag is the end of the inquiry. But for a man operating on severe misjudgment and subjective profiling, a clean record was merely a smokescreen. In Miller's cynical internal narrative, the flawless driving and clean registration simply meant the driver was a highly organized criminal, perhaps a sophisticated burglar scouting massive estates under the cover of night. The law is remarkably clear regarding traffic stops. To pull a civilian over, an officer must possess a quantifiable, articulable suspicion that a specific crime has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur. Miller had absolutely nothing. The luxury sedan maintained the speed limit with robotic precision. The driver utilized turn signals perfectly and came to complete absolute stops at every intersection. knowing that activating his emergency lights on the public roadway without probable cause would result in a brutal legal dismantling by any competent defense attorney. Miller chose a far darker, far more dangerous path. He decided to stalk the vehicle, hovering in the blind spots, practically begging the universe for the driver to tap a painted line or roll through a stop sign. Instead, the sleek sedan slowed, activated its signal, and turned gracefully onto a sprawling, stone-paved private driveway. Arthur guided his vehicle up the gentle incline, bringing it to a smooth halt precisely in front of his custom-built, three-car garage. He shifted the transmission into park, exhaled a long breath of relief, and reached across the console for his leather briefcase. He was home. He was safe. And that was the precise fraction of a second when Officer David Miller initiated the total destruction of his own career. Driven by a desperate need to validate his own baseless assumptions, Miller completely abandoned his training, his ethics, and the United States Constitution. He didn't park on the public street to observe. He didn't approach the property on foot to initiate a polite, consensual conversation. Instead, he violently cranked the steering wheel of his heavy utility vehicle, aggressively breaching the legal property line of the estate. He accelerated up the private stone driveway and slammed on his brakes, angling his interceptor to intentionally and unlawfully block the sedan from leaving. With a forceful strike to his center console, the officer activated his overhead light bar. The serene, quiet darkness of the estate was instantly obliterated. Violent, strobing flashes of crimson and sapphire painted the beautiful brick facade of the judge's home, casting chaotic shadows across the manicured landscaping. Inside the vault-like isolation of his luxury vehicle, Arthur paused. His large hand remained resting casually on the handle of his briefcase. He did not flinch. He did not panic. He simply lifted his chin and looked calmly into his rearview mirror at the blinding lights. As a master of jurisprudence, Arthur processed the reality of the situation with terrifying, crystalline clarity. He was parked within the curtilage of his own private residence. The officer behind him had no warrant, no emergency justification, and no legally valid reason to cross that property line. To simply roll down the window and hand over his driver's license would be to legally consent to this outrageous violation, effectively curing the officer's catastrophic mistake. Arthur decided in that very heartbeat that he would not grant this rogue patrolman a shred of legal cover. The snare had been set, and the officer had foolishly locked himself inside of it. The heavy door of the interceptor groaned open, shutting with a loud metallic slam. Officer Miller stepped out into the chaotic strobe lights, heavily projecting a manufactured aggressive dominance. He unclipped a heavy tactical flashlight, his thumb resting instinctively on the release mechanism of his duty holster, and marched up the private stones. His boots created a loud, abrasive crunching sound that pierced the night. Inside the sedan, the judge remained entirely motionless. He didn't frantically search his pockets. He didn't reach toward the glove compartment. He calmly placed both of his empty hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, waiting in absolute silence. He was no longer a tired man coming home from work. He was a federal judge actively observing a real-time constitutional crisis. When Miller reached the driver's side, he aggressively shined the blinding beam of his flashlight directly against the tinted glass, sweeping the interior before rapping his knuckles harshly against the window. Arthur smoothly pressed the window control. The thick glass vanished silently into the doorframe, admitting the freezing night air and the abrasive glare of the light bar. "Evening," Miller barked, his voice laced with a heavy, arrogant edge. He offered no greeting, no name, and no badge number. He leaned his upper body aggressively toward the window frame, physically invading the driver's space. "License, registration, proof of insurance. And you can go ahead and explain to me exactly what you're doing parked in this specific driveway." Arthur's hands remained locked on the wheel. He turned his head with slow, deliberate precision, looking straight through the blinding light to lock his dark, piercing eyes entirely on the patrolman. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deep, unshakable baritone the exact voice that commanded absolute silence in a packed federal courthouse. "Officer," Arthur articulated perfectly, his tone completely devoid of fear, "you are currently standing on private property, specifically the constitutionally protected curtilage of a private home. State for me right now your specific, articulable, reasonable suspicion for initiating a detention on this private land." The absolute flawlessness of the legal vocabulary hit the patrolman like a physical shockwave. Police officers who rely on intimidation are accustomed to dealing with stammering, nervous citizens or people who raise their voices in panic. They are profoundly unequipped to be cross-examined with Supreme Court-level terminology by an impeccably dressed man who refuses to flinch. For a brief, flickering moment, Miller's cognitive processing stalled, but rather than recognizing the massive legal wall he had just crashed into, his fragile ego seized the controls. He viewed the driver's intelligence not as a valid defense, but as a severe, disrespectful threat to his badge. "I don't need a law school lecture from you," Miller snapped back, shifting his weight and resting his hand heavier against his duty belt, a classic intimidation tactic. He immediately defaulted to the laziest, most legally hollow excuse in the patrol handbook. "We've had residential burglaries in this exact area. You don't look like you fit in around here, and you're sitting in a dark driveway with a running motor. That makes you a suspicious person in my book. Now hand me your identification before I legally extract you from that seat for failure to identify." Arthur knew the case law inside and out. A vague claim of being suspicious requires concrete, specific facts that a crime is actively occurring. Existing in an affluent area while happening to be a minority is not a violation of any criminal code. Furthermore, under the established doctrines of the Fourth Amendment, law enforcement cannot demand physical identification without a lawful detention, and they certainly cannot execute a detention on private property without a warrant or exigent circumstances. Arthur had personally authored appellate decisions affirming these exact principles. "Your justification is legally bankrupt," Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a freezing, razor-sharp frequency. "You witnessed 0 traffic infractions. You do not possess a warrant. You have no 911 dispatch tying my vehicle to any reported crime. You have stalked me onto my own land based purely on your own baseless profiling. I will absolutely not provide you with my identification, as you possess 0 lawful authority to demand it." Miller's face flushed violently. The chaotic police lights illuminated the pure, unadulterated anger radiating from his expression. He was entirely outmatched intellectually, but out here on the dark pavement, he held the monopoly on physical force. What enraged him most wasn't the refusal. It was the fact that the man behind the wheel was looking at him with a sense of clinical, devastating pity. "You think you're untouchable? You think big words are going to save you?" Miller growled, taking a half-step back and aggressively ripping a pair of steel restraints from his tactical belt. The metallic clicking of the handcuffs sounded incredibly loud in the quiet air. "You are officially under arrest for interfering with an investigation and failure to ID. Step out of the vehicle right this second." Arthur analyzed the sweating, volatile officer, and then his eyes flicked upward, catching the subtle, blinking green light of the body-worn camera secured to the officer's chest. The trap was now fully armed and operational. "I am complying with your physical demands purely under duress," Arthur announced loudly, projecting his voice so the microphone would capture every single vowel. "But let the digital record clearly reflect that you are actively escalating an unlawful trespass into a felony armed kidnapping." The judge slowly disengaged his seatbelt. He was entirely prepared to let this rogue officer dig the grave of his own career as deeply as possible. The heavy door swung open, and Arthur stepped out into the crisp night. Standing at his full height on the stones of his own driveway, the judge was a physically formidable presence, broad, tall, and radiating an immense, undeniable aura of authority. Miller instinctively retreated a step, his hand tightening further around the grip of his holstered firearm. He had not anticipated the suspect to be so physically imposing. To instantly mask his sudden spike of fear, the officer overcompensated with brute verbal force. "Turn around, face the glass, and put your hands flat on the roof, now." Arthur did not argue. He knew the absolute golden rule of surviving an encounter with a legally compromised, heavily armed patrolman. You fight the war in a brightly lit courtroom, not on dark pavement. He turned smoothly, placing his large palms flat against the pristine, cold metal of his vehicle's roof. Miller lunged forward with entirely unnecessary force, seizing Arthur's left wrist and violently wrenching it behind his back, pushing the shoulder joint near its breaking point. Arthur exhaled sharply, but offered zero muscle resistance. He intentionally kept his body entirely slack, denying the officer any fictional excuse to claim the suspect was tensing up or resisting. The heavy steel clamped down brutally over Arthur's tailored cuffs, biting directly into his skin. Miller squeezed the metal ratchets until they were painfully tight. "You are detained for obstruction and failure to identify," the officer panted, shoving his forearm aggressively between Arthur's shoulder blades, pinning the restrained man against the luxury car. Across the wide street, a porch light illuminated. The massive disturbance was finally waking the wealthy neighborhood. Miller felt a sudden rush of triumphant adrenaline. He believed he was actively protecting this pristine community from a dangerous outsider. He genuinely believed he was the hero of this narrative. Arthur turned his chin just enough to angle his voice directly toward the blinking camera lens on the officer's chest. "Officer," the judge stated, his voice cutting cleanly over the sound of the idling engines, "I am completely unarmed and offering zero resistance. Let this recording serve as permanent evidence that you have forcefully removed me from my vehicle on my own private property, absent a warrant or probable cause. You are officially executing a crime under the color of law." "I told you to keep your mouth shut," Miller snarled, increasing the pressure on the judge's spine. "You don't tell me what the law is. I am the law out here." With the suspect immobilized, the patrolman eagerly began a highly intrusive physical search. He aggressively patted down the outside of Arthur's trousers, fully expecting to find burglar tools, stolen jewelry, or narcotics. He found nothing but a heavy brass ring of house keys. Deeply frustrated but still operating on blind arrogance, Miller moved his search to the suit jacket. As his hand swept across the chest, he felt a dense, heavy, rectangular object in the inner breast pocket. "Bingo," the officer whispered, a cruel smirk crossing his face. This was it. This was the moment he would yank out a cheap plastic ID, shine his flashlight on an address from the impoverished side of the county, and validate his massive ego. He would prove this man was a liar. Without a single word of consent, Miller shoved his hand into the custom-tailored interior of the jacket and extracted a thick, heavily bound leather wallet. He had absolutely no comprehension that he had just pulled the pin on a legal grenade that would obliterate his life. Miller stepped back, leaving the handcuffed man pinned against the car. He breathed heavily, puffed up with the toxic pride of a hunter claiming his prize. He held the wallet in his right hand. Almost immediately, the tactile feedback confused him. It wasn't a normal, flimsy billfold. It was incredibly rigid, constructed of thick, premium leather designed to protect something of immense structural importance. But Miller's bias blinded him to the warning signs. He tucked his flashlight under his arm, angling the blinding beam directly down at his hands, ensuring the body camera had a perfect view of his impending victory. He forcefully flipped the leather open. He expected to find a heavily worn state driver's license. Instead, the intense LED light reflected violently off solid, polished metal. First, the glare subsided, revealing a massive, deeply recessed gold medallion dominating the right side of the leather. It wasn't a standard patrolman's shield or a shiny county star. It was an impeccably stamped, incredibly heavy seal that commanded absolute reverence. Second, Miller's eyes focused on the center of that gold medal. He saw the majestic, terrifying wings of the federal eagle, clutching a bundle of arrows and an olive branch. It was the Great Seal of the United States. Third, his vision snapped in sheer panic to the official credentials secured to the left panel. The portrait photograph perfectly, undeniably, matched the face of the restrained man leaning against the vehicle. The name was printed in stark, unforgiving black text: Arthur Vance. Fourth, and most catastrophically, the officer read the official title printed directly underneath. The words practically burned a hole through his corneas: Chief United States District Judge. The oxygen in Officer Miller's lungs instantly crystallized. His heart completely stopped beating for a full second. All the color violently drained from his skin, leaving his face a sickening ashen gray. His brain utterly short-circuited, desperately fighting to reject the apocalyptic reality of what his eyes were confirming. Frantically, he scanned the bottom of the card for the residential address. The numbers on the credential perfectly matched the brass numbers bolted to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The adrenaline that had fueled his aggressive power trip instantly mutated into a suffocating, crushing wave of pure existential terror. The leather wallet suddenly felt like a block of highly volatile explosives. His hands began to shake with such violent intensity that the flashlight slipped from his armpit, its beam bouncing erratically across the ground. The man he had stalked, profiled, unlawfully detained, dragged out of a car and physically assaulted on private property was not a criminal. He was an Article III federal judge. He was a lifetime appointee confirmed by the United States Senate. He was a man whose daily occupation was destroying the careers of rogue law enforcement officers who violated the Constitution. And Miller had just slapped steel cuffs on him purely based on an inexcusable, baseless misjudgment. The suspicious person defense was completely evaporated. The failure to identify charge was legally non-existent. By physically restraining a citizen on their own property without cause, the officer had transcended a simple civil lawsuit. He had committed a textbook federal felony, deprivation of rights under color of law, and he had filmed the entire flawless execution of his own crime in high definition. Miller slowly, agonizingly looked up. Arthur was standing exactly where he had been left. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He simply turned his head and looked at the terrified patrolman. His eyes were completely empty of rage. Instead, they were cold, calculating, and ruthlessly clinical. It was the gaze of an executioner watching a condemned man tie his own noose. The wallet slipped from Miller's trembling fingers, landing on the stones with a soft thud. Every ounce of his manufactured street bravado vanished into the freezing air. He stumbled forward, his boots heavy, frantically fumbling for the tiny metal handcuff key on his belt. He could barely grip it. Your Honor," Miller choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He held the key out like a beggar pleading for his life. "Sir, I am so sorry. This was a catastrophic mistake. Please, just let me take these off you right now, and we can—" "Do not touch me, officer," Arthur commanded. The judge did not raise his voice by a single decibel, yet the sheer gravity of his tone froze the patrolman dead in his tracks. Miller's hand hovered in the air, trembling violently. "You do not possess my consent to remove these restraints," Arthur stated smoothly, turning his shoulders so his face was perfectly framed by the officer's body camera lens. "You initiated an illegal detention based on severe implicit bias. You escalated to physical violence and armed kidnapping on my land. These restraints are no longer police equipment. They are the physical evidence of a federal crime." Miller swallowed hard, swaying slightly as if he might faint. "Please, Your Honor, I thought you were— I just wanted to keep the area safe. Please." "Take a step back," Arthur interrupted, his voice an absolute void of mercy. "Do not touch me, and do not dare touch that camera. You will activate your radio right now and summon your watch commander to this exact address. Execute the order." Utterly broken and hyperventilating, the patrolman backed away. With a shaking, uncoordinated hand, He grabbed his shoulder microphone. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor to my location. Code 3. The next 10 minutes were an agonizing psychological torture for the patrolman. He paced in the street, clutching his head, unable to look at the imposing figure. Arthur did not move an inch. He stood tall, enduring the sharp pain in his wrists, waiting with endless patience for the hammer of the justice system to fall. Finally, a heavy white interceptor bearing supervisor decals roared down the street, jumping the curb and braking hard. Lieutenant Graves, a seasoned commander, sprinted out of the vehicle. Graves assessed the chaotic lighting, saw his pale, terrified subordinate, and then his eyes locked onto the towering man in the bespoke suit, handcuffed against the luxury sedan. Graves had testified in federal court. He knew exactly who that face belonged to. "Miller, what in the name of God have you done?" Graves gasped, sprinting up the driveway. "Why is the chief judge in restraints?" Before the hyperventilating patrolman could even attempt a lie, Arthur spoke. "Lieutenant," the judge said calmly, "your subordinate unlawfully breached my property line. He demanded papers without suspicion, assaulted me when I cited constitutional precedent, and performed a warrantless search of my person to extract my federal credentials." Graves stopped dead, staring at Miller with absolute horror. The patrolman looked at the ground, unable to deny a single syllable. "Good Lord, Your Honor, I am so profoundly sorry," the lieutenant practically begged, ripping his own universal key from his belt and rushing forward. He swiftly unlocked the steel ratchets. Arthur brought his arms forward with slow, deliberate movements, adjusting his suit jacket and rubbing the deep red lacerations on his wrists. He did not offer a word of thanks. He looked down at his fallen wallet, waiting silently until the lieutenant scrambled to pick it up and hand it back to him. "Apologies do not repair shattered constitutional rights, Lieutenant," Arthur said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm as he placed the wallet back into his jacket. "I am formally instructing you to secure all dash camera data, body camera footage, and dispatch logs regarding this incident immediately. Tomorrow morning, my office will be delivering this file to the Department of Justice and the FBI for a full criminal prosecution." Graves closed his eyes, realizing his entire department was about to be buried under a catastrophic federal indictment and a civil rights lawsuit that would bankrupt the city. "Now," Arthur said, turning his back on them and walking toward his front door, "remove your vehicles from my property." He didn't look back to watch them panic. He didn't have to. Officer David Miller was already a ghost, a man who had permanently incinerated his own life and freedom because he allowed a baseless assumption to override the law. He believed he was the ultimate authority on the street, right up until the exact second he slapped handcuffs on the man who enforces the Constitution. When those in power allow their biases to dictate their actions, the fallout is always devastating. But it's profoundly satisfying when that bias crashes into someone who cannot be bullied. Do you think the officer should face federal prison time for this severe overreach, or just lose his badge? Drop your verdict in the comments.